This is the Book of Balaam, son of Beor, a seer of the gods. And to that man came the gods at night, and they spoke to him according to the utterance of El, and they spoke to Balaam, son of Beor, thus. And Balaam arose in the morning. He was not able to eat, and he fasted, while he was weeping grievously. And his people came to him, and they said to Balaam, son of Beor, Why do you fast, and why do you weep? And he said to them, Sit down, I will tell you what the Shaddaim are thinking. Now come, see what the gods are about to do. The gods gathered, while the Shaddai deities met in assembly, and said to Shamash, You may break the bolts of heaven. In your clouds let there be gloominess and no brilliance, darkness and not radiance. You may cause terror by the gloomy clouds, but do not be angry forever. For the swift is reproaching the eagle, and the vultures brood the ostrich. Some are laughing at wise men, and the poor woman is preparing an ointment of myrrh, and all are beholding the oppression exercised by Sargar and Ashtar. Destruction and ruins. A lot of people know the story of Balaam from the Book of Numbers. Maybe you've come across it in your Bible, or if you're anything like me, you had it read to you in Sunday school. Specifically, the story of Balaam's donkey is favorably remembered by a lot of us. But although the story of Balaam in the Old Testament spans over 3 chapters in the Book of Numbers alone, what you just heard wasn't an excerpt from that passage. We're going to talk a lot about Balaam today on the Plague of Frogs. In case you couldn't guess it by the title of this video, the lost prophet in question is Balaam. Now, I am cheating a little bit because the text doesn't call Balaam a prophet. He isn't called that in any ancient historical record that we have. But what Balaam does in this story and elsewhere seems to qualify him as something approximating a prophet. The Hebrew word that's used to define Balaam in this story is kesim, which is a common Hebrew word used to refer to people who typically practice pagan divination or sorcery in some translations. So the idea seems to be that Balaam is a spiritually gifted person who falls outside of the sphere of Orthodox Judaism, or Orthodox Israelite religion at the time. But that being said, Balaam's powers seem to approximate a lot of what we see from the prophets. Specifically, one ancient source that we'll talk about today refers to Balaam as a seer, somebody who receives visions from the divine realm, which is a very common trope in prophetic literature of Israel. In the ancient world, divination was the means of acquiring knowledge from the divine realm. And there were a lot of different ways people could go about this. Many of these actually accrued into sciences over time, at least in the eyes of the ancients. So the most popular forms of divination in antiquity were things like astrology, or the reading of entrails, referred to as extispicy. Specifically, the reading of the liver, which had a whole science of its own, was called hepatomancy. So people trying to look at different parts of phenomena in the world for messages from the divine realm. Some of them were spontaneous and just sort of happened by accident. An example of this would be a cow or a sheep being born to a farmer with 2 heads or an extra leg. News of this could be taken to the city, where it would be interpreted by the appropriate religious authorities. Other situations, though, like astrology and the reading of entrails, was a science in and of itself. These were things where they have entire manuals, which still are preserved to this day, that walk us through what different things mean in the stars or in the spots on an animal's liver. When I said that the ancients used sciences to detail the arts of divination, I wasn't kidding. They went into scientific detail about these things. Here's an example of an old cuneiform extispicy report. If the well-being is overturned facing the gallbladder, it means strife, dispersal of a man's household. If the front of the atrophied part is effaced, if the gallbladder has a swelling upward than its narrow part, it means the word of the ruler will be unpleasant to his officials. Kind of suck to have your entire life dictated by how guts spill out of an animal, but I guess that's the way that the Babylonians rolled. So to reiterate, divination is the art of trying to acquire messages from the divine realm through some sort of intermediary process. And the form of divination that most of us who are familiar with the Bible are most familiar with is prophecy, because prophecy technically qualifies as a subset of divination. Again, divination very broadly referred to, it means something like trying to acquire communication about the world from the divine realm. Prophecy is probably the most direct way of doing that, because prophecy is basically waiting for speech or direct messaging from the divine realm into the world of humankind. The difference is that in most forms of divination you have a medium object. So, for instance, in astrology, the stars themselves, or the heavenly objects, are the medium of transferring information from the divine realm to the human realm. In extispacy, the reading of entrails, it's the entrails themselves that are the communicative medium through which the divine realm accesses the worldly realm and vice versa. But with prophecy, the prophet is the medium. There's this sort of direct connection between the divine world and the world of humankind that sort of cuts aside all of the intermediary tools that other forms of divination might rely on. In the Old Testament of the Bible, only two forms of divination are explicitly approved of, and these two are prophecy and the casting of lots with the Urim and the Thummim. John Walton notes that both of these methods leave the agency of the interaction in the divine realm. That's to say, human beings can't induce prophecy, and they can't induce a correct outcome or a favorable outcome through the Urim and the Thummim. Both of these rely on God to be the individual who's actually making things happen in order to get the desired outcomes or effects. In addition to the fact that only prophecy and on occasion the casting of lots were the only forms of divination practiced in Israel, all other forms were explicitly forbidden. The practice of sorcery, astrology, necromancy, and hepatomancy were forbidden for ancient Israelites. So basically, in Israelite theology, all agency in divine contact was vested with God in heaven. It wasn't something that a human being could invoke on occasion if they wanted contact with the divine realm. The divine realm had to talk to you if it wanted to. You couldn't talk to the divine realm, at least not directly, unless the divine realm actively wanted to do so with you as well. So to summarize, divination is the practice of engaging in communication with the divine realm to acquire information that ordinarily you wouldn't be able to have on the mortal plane. In ancient Israel, and thus in the Old Testament, only two forms of divination were acceptable by God, that being prophecy, the sending of messages to prophets from God specifically, and on occasion the casting of the Urim and the Thummim. Now, the Urim and the Thummim deserve their own video at some point as well, so I won't dig too into them here. But suffice it to say that when it came to interpretation of the divine will, Israel only had essentially one option, which is primarily prophecy, because the Urim and the Thummim really didn't come up all that often. So all these other forms of divination that the ancient peoples practiced, astrology, extispacy, necromancy, etc., were cut off from Israel, at least in the most ideal circumstances. It's worth noting as well that although prophecy was the primary mode of divine contact in ancient Israel and therefore in the Old Testament of the Bible, the practice of prophecy was actually pretty widespread in antiquity. The Israelites weren't the only ones who had prophets. Although there might be different titles for these people, there are numerous examples of people across the ancient world who received dreams, visions, and messages from the divine realm and who passed them on to others, especially kings. Now, what exactly you make of that is going to be informed by your metaphysics. That's how you think the world works. For somebody who has a materialistic or a naturalistic metaphysics, someone who really doesn't think there's anything in the divine realm at all, you'll probably conclude that anybody who claims to have visions or claims to have prophetic dreams is either somebody who's deceived themselves and perhaps others, or perhaps somebody who genuinely had some interesting things happening in their brains that they interpret as messages from the gods. If you are a theist or a deist or somebody who believes that there's something beyond the purely natural realm, then your metaphysics might suggest that, yeah, for some of these people, maybe there was actually something feeding information to those persons. For Christians, there's a couple ways of looking at the issue of pagan prophets. One of them is to say that these were people who claimed to be prophets, who claimed to receive divine revelation and divine insight, but who really didn't, and so they were tricksters and frauds. Another way is to say that some of them genuinely did believe that they were receiving these things, but again, it was all neurochemistry going on. And a final option is that these people were receiving messages from the divine realm, but they were receiving them from inferior spiritual beings, or sometimes even malicious spiritual beings, so demons and the like, were actually providing information from the divine realm, but it wasn't benevolent for human use. I want to talk a little bit more about what prophecy is too, because I think a lot of us have this idea that prophecy means to foretell the future before it happens. And that's sort of what the word prophecy means in 21st century English. Somebody is a prophet if they can accurately predict things that are going to happen. The spiritually inclined may use that term literally, but for all of us, even the secularly inclined, we still use the term prophet, if not perhaps a bit ironically, to refer to people who were able to make educated guesses about what the future holds. So, the term prophecy among 21st century Westerners at least tends to mean foretelling the future, but that's not exactly what it meant in antiquity. Although it was technically possible for the divine realm to disclose events that haven't taken place yet, the primary goal of prophecy in antiquity in both Israelite and non-Israelite prophetic oracles was to provide the divine realm's perspective on events that are happening currently. Another way of saying it is that prophecy is meant to disclose the divine realm's plans for the current situation on Earth to a human audience. When events that haven't taken place yet are referenced, they aren't necessarily done so as something that's already happened in the future. More so, the idea within prophetic oracles is that we're going to tell you what's going to happen if things continue on the road that they are right now. John Walton gives the example of handing out a syllabus on the first day of class. When all of the students show up for his class, very eager to learn that day, on the first day of class, he'll hand out his syllabus to everybody there, and students will find in that syllabus a prophecy, if you will, of all of the days that the class is going to meet and the topics that are going to be discussed. So the syllabus isn't telling you that these things are going to happen for sure. The syllabus's design is to disclose to the students in the class what the professor of the class's plan is given the current circumstances. Now, those plans could change. Something could interfere with the scheduling. Maybe they wouldn't be able to talk about a certain topic on a certain day. Maybe somebody important would get sick, and so a class would have to be skipped or pushed back for another time. But the syllabus provides people with an idealized snapshot of what's going to happen that they can base their present behavior on. This leads us to a very important point when we're talking about the nature of ancient prophecy, and that is that prophecy was contingent. When a prophecy was given about what's going to happen in the future, that outcome could be changed based on current behaviors going on right now. The best example of this, I think, is the book of Jonah, the second half in particular. When Jonah finally makes it to the city of Nineveh, he goes throughout it preaching that in 3 days God is going to destroy the city. That's the prophecy. God is going to destroy the city of Nineveh. That is the message that Jonah announces to the citizens of Nineveh. But in that interim time, the Ninevites all repent in sackcloth and ashes. They weep, they beg God for mercy, and as a result, God relents. The prophecy was contingent. God said he was going to destroy Nineveh, but because the people relented, God did not destroy Nineveh. Now, this isn't the case of God changing his mind. Think about it like you're taking care of a toddler. You're telling the toddler, because they're throwing a fit, that they're going to have to go into timeout, and that they're going into timeout now. But if the toddler immediately changes their behavior, all of a sudden they don't need to go into timeout anymore, and they can continue about their day normally. Obviously, an issue that comes up with this interpretation is what to make of Christological oracles, or Christ-centered prophecies in the Old Testament. And that would take us a little bit too far off track for the current video, but it's probably something that Tommy and I will have a long discussion on later on the main channel podcast, if anybody's interested in that in the future. So the big prophecies to take away from here, So the big takeaways from this section are that prophecy was a form of divination meant to access the divine realm and look for a message from the divine realm directly, and that prophecy was largely contingent. The divine realm had a plan that was being revealed to the prophet currently, but that plan could change depending on how circumstances worked out here on Earth. Alright, now that we've established what prophecy is and what prophecy isn't, let's talk about the man of the hour himself, Balaam. I want to reiterate the fact that although Balaam isn't called a prophet in the Hebrew text, he does nevertheless display signs of being a spiritual craftsman of some sort in the ancient world. The ancients didn't have a uniform terminology for the spiritually gifted. There were a lot of terms thrown about there, but it seems that Balaam operated within this broader category of the spiritually gifted. So keep that in mind for the ensuing discussion. Let's start out by taking a look at the story of Balaam in the Old Testament itself. Like I said, a lot of us who remember this story from Sunday school remember in particular the episode of Balaam's donkey, but a lot of us don't realize that the story of Balaam is substantially larger than that. In fact, it takes up the entirety of Numbers 22, 23, and 24. So 3 chapters of a very substantial book are dedicated to the story of Balaam. I think it's also worth noting, purely because I find it interesting, that some scholars believe that this part of the Book of Numbers was originally its own separate book. So before the Book of Numbers came around, the Balaam story, or the Balaam cycle, we're not sure what it would have been called, existed as its own piece of literature that the author of Numbers fit into their own narrative at a later time. We see this happen quite frequently in historical literature. There are similar theories that the Elijah stories of 2 Kings and 1 Kings were originally part of their own Elijah book that the authors of Kings took and incorporated into their own text. And we see similar things happen in actual examples with other parts of ancient literature. For instance, the Epic of Gilgamesh incorporates the Atrahasis epic almost in its entirety into the later part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So you have a large narrative taking a somewhat smaller narrative and using it as a building block for its own story arc. This theory is reinforced not only by the fact that the story of Balaam seems very well self-contained and like it could have operated on its own, but also because the perspective of the Balaam section is very different from the rest of the Old Testament. Throughout the Book of Numbers and the books that came before it, we track the Israelites' progress through the desert from Sinai on their way to the Promised Land. But when we come to the Balaam material, suddenly we're seeing things told from the perspective of the king of Moab, Balak. In fact, the Israelites' perspective is never mentioned at all in the entire Balaam cycle. So we're following the Israelites for the entire story, and all of a sudden, the scene changes to a completely different point of view before changing back to the Israelites again after the fact. So it seems generally probable that this was originally its own book. What it was called, who wrote it, and things of that nature has probably been lost to time, but I find it very interesting all the same. I'm going to go through the story of the Balaam cycle for anybody who hasn't heard it before, or for those of us who maybe just haven't read that story in its entirety anytime recently. So, at this point in the Old Testament story, the Israelites have been to Mount Sinai. They've left Egypt where they were slaves, they came to Mount Sinai where they received the law of God, later called the law of Moses, and now they're moving towards the Promised Land. Well, that generation would never enter the Promised Land because of their own sins, which again deserves another comment at a later time. They would get as close as they could to the Promised Land so that the next generation could enter it. So, to approach the Promised Land, the Israelites set out from Mount Sinai and come along the eastern border, staying on the far side of the Jordan River. Now, the only problem with this is the fact that the eastern side of the Jordan River was already populated by the kingdoms of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. The Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites were the neighbors of the Israelite nation, and they're also remembered in Israelite lore as being the relatives of the patriarchs of Israel themselves. For instance, the patriarch Jacob, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being the last one, his brother Esau was considered to be the father of the Edomites. Going back even further, Abraham's nephew Lot was considered to be the father of Ammon and Moab, who became the fathers of the Ammonite and Moabite states respectively. But although these were relatives of Israelites and were their neighbors for a very long time, they were very seldom on good terms with the Israelites, and that comes out in this story. As the story of Numbers has it, the Israelites were trying to pass through Edomite, Moabite, and Ammonite territory so that they could prepare for the next generation to enter into the Promised Land. They tried to make themselves as innocuous as possible, but rather naturally, these other nations didn't particularly appreciate a large convoy of people they didn't know coming out of a foreign country saying, "We're just passing through." It seems a little bit suspicious. So at one point, Balak, the king of Moab, sets out to call in a little bit of supernatural aid to stop the Israelites in their tracks. And his means of doing that is by hiring the sorcerer and the seer, Balaam. As I mentioned before, Balaam was considered to be a sorcerer or a diviner or somebody who worked in the divine realm. Now, remember that this book was written by Israelites, and so from their perspective, Balaam is sort of a witchcraft type figure. He's not working with God to obtain messages from the divine realm, and yet it still acknowledges that Balaam did make contact with the divine realm. So Balaam was some sort of wonder worker or sorcerer from outside the people of Israel. So Balak knows of this reputation, and he wants Balaam to use his magic or his divination or his divine arts in general to call down curses upon Israel. Now, interestingly, despite being portrayed as a sorcerer, Balaam's response is telling. He tells Balak, look, I can't say things and make them happen. All I can tell you is what the divine realm is planning. That's it. So if the divine realm wants to curse Israel, I can curse them. But if it wants to bless Israel, I have to bless them. I hope you understand that. Now, Balak doesn't take no for an answer. After much urging and much bribing, he finally convinces Balaam to come out to Moab from wherever he comes from, it's not really stated, and curse the Israelites. Balaam agrees finally, and he saddles his trusty steed, a female donkey, and makes his way towards the kingdom of Moab. But on the way, Balaam runs into a peculiar difficulty, and this is where we find the story of Balaam's donkey. From Balaam's perspective, he's riding along, perhaps thinking about what he's going to buy with all of the silver he picked up from the Moabites, maybe a new Corvette when he gets home, and all of a sudden the donkey stops. Balaam isn't particularly pleased with that, as one wouldn't be if their primary mode of transportation shut down in the wilderness. But Balaam urges the donkey onwards, even beating the animal, but the donkey refuses to move. Balaam gets real worked up before he finally opens his eyes and realizes what's been in front of him the whole time, and it's an angel. The angel informs Balaam that the donkey is smarter than him and has more insight into the divine realm than he does, because if the donkey had continued forward, the angel would have cut Balaam down. So the point of this particular story is to show that although Balaam has access to the divine realm as a sorcerer or as a diviner or as somebody who dabbles in those arts, he's spiritually blind beyond even a simple donkey. That's kind of the function of that story, which I find quite cute. But the angel encourages Balaam to keep going, and Balaam does indeed go on his way. He meets up with Balak, and they observe the Israelites from a distance. Balaam lights some sacrifices, probably trying to invoke the divine realm by offering them sacrifice in return for answers, and Balak waits with bated breath for what the divine realm has to say about the nation of Israel. Now, Balaam is successful in tapping into the divine realm, which is exactly what Balak wanted to happen. But instead of tapping into the gods of the nations or the gods of the Moabites to call down divine curses upon the people of Israel gathered in the distance, instead, the God of Israel overrides Balaam's contact with the divine realm and causes blessing to pour forth from Balaam instead, which naturally Balak is not happy about, because he just paid this guy a lot of money to come here and curse his enemies, but here he is speaking on behalf of their God and blessing them instead. Kind of embarrassing. Balak tries moving Balaam around a couple of different times, maybe thinking he got overwhelmed by divine contact because he saw the whole of the Israelites, but no matter where he moves him and no matter how many times he tells Balaam to tap into the divine realm, the answer is always the same. The God of Israel speaks through Balaam and blesses the nation of Israel by Balaam, rather than the gods of the nations accessing the human world through Balaam and cursing the Israelites. So Balak's attempts are foiled on every turn. Frustrated and no doubt at a loss for what to do next, Balak finally sends Balaam away, and he leaves, though not before returning fire with several oracles about the fates of the neighboring countries of Israel that are in God's plans for the future currently. And that's where the story ends. The Moabite king's plan was foiled, and the diviner who claimed to speak for the divine had less spiritual insight than his own donkey. And throughout the whole narrative, the only divine actor on the stage was the God of Israel. The moral of the story, if you can reduce it to a single moral, is that the God of Israel, the God of the world, is the one in charge of the divine realm. And so, although Balaam came from a foreign land, although he had the reputation as being a pagan diviner, nevertheless, even Balaam was an instrument for the God of Israel to bless his people through. So the story is really about who's actually in charge of the events in the world and the events in the divine realm. We see this specifically in the story of Balaam's attempt at cursing Israel, although responding in blessing. And we also see a little bit of fun made of these pagan diviners with the story of the donkey, where the donkey is able to see things in the divine realm that the pagan diviner isn't able to. It's worth noting here, too, that the Israelite opinions of Balaam do tend to be negative. Every time he's mentioned in some sort of negative way, like in the book of Joshua, the book of Deuteronomy, and this story in particular. But it is interesting that when the prophet Micah remembers this story, the only thing he brings up about Balaam is the fact that he talked back against Balak and said, I can only speak from the divine realm what's given to me. I can't make things up on my own. So maybe not all Israelites harbored ill will against Balaam. And it's with all this talk about the story of Balaam in the Bible and all this talk about what prophecy is that finally gets us to the meat of the issue here. The book of the lost prophet, the book of Balaam. Now, if you open up your Bible and look through the table of contents, you won't find the book of Balaam there. Likewise, if you pick up a copy of the Apocrypha or Charlesworth's Pseudepigrapha and look for the book of Balaam, there's a pretty good chance you won't find it there either. And the reason is that the book of Balaam that we're going to be discussing today isn't an ancient document written in the Second Temple period or in the early Christian period like a lot of pseudepigraphal or falsely written books were. Instead, it's an inscription that was found in a site called Deir Alla, and it was discovered in the second half of the 20th century AD. It's been under close scrutiny ever since that time, but what we find announces itself as the Book of Balaam the Seer. The site of Deir Alla, as I said, was excavated primarily in the 60s and the 70s. The text that was discovered there, the so-called Book of Balaam, was probably written around 800 BC. This would be around the time of the divided monarchy for anybody who's keeping track of Israelite history. And the reason I said so-called Book of Balaam is purely because this wasn't something that was written down on a scroll or on a codex, but rather it was found inscribed on the wall of a house or of a building in general. There was a plaster layer that had the so-called document of Balaam or Book of Balaam inscribed entirely upon the wall of it. So it doesn't exactly come around in a nice paperback or in a scroll form. This is a document that we found inscribed on a literal wall. The Book of Balaam from Deir Alla contains several poems supposedly spoken by the prophet or the seer Balaam. And these poems describe how the Shaddayan, a group of Levantine deities, appeared to Balaam in a dream and disclosed their plans for the human population of some unknown place to Balaam in that dream. Now, unfortunately, these poems are very fragmentary in their current state. They've clearly suffered damage. The first poem is the more legible of the two, but the second poem has suffered from considerable damage that makes describing its contents very, very difficult. Now, what we can tell from the poems is that the poems have both content and structure that are very similar to what we find in the Old Testament. Now, this isn't to say that these are early copies of the Old Testament versions of Balaam's poems, or that they're a derivative from them, but it may suggest that because their contents and because their style are so similar, that these poems may go back to the actual figure of Balaam, who was likewise responsible for the poems that found their way into the Book of Numbers. Remember from earlier in the video, we talked about the fact that the Balaam cycle in Numbers 22 through 24 shows signs of being a pre-existing document of its own right. It's also possible that the poetic compositions found therein were likewise earlier compositions, and if that is the case, then we have some of Balaam's poems finding their way into the Book of Numbers eventually, and some other of Balaam's poems being preserved separately at the Deir Alla text. All of this is to say that the figure of Balaam seems to have been a historical ancient seer who was respected by a lot of different people in the ancient world. He found his way into Israelite literature, but was ultimately vilified by most Israelites as a negative figure, as we find him in the Book of Numbers itself. But others outside the sphere of Israel preserved his poems long into the future. Whoever composed the Deir Alla text on the walls of the building that they were discovered in was very clearly a fan of Balaam. So the figure of Balaam remained lurking in the minds of the people in this area for a long time after his actual death. So that brings us back to the title of this video, the Book of Balaam. The really cool thing is it turns out we have two books of Balaam. We have the narrative that was incorporated into the Book of Numbers, that Numbers chapters 22 through 24, which may have been its own book written at some point prior to the composition of Numbers, and also the Balaam text of Deir Alla. Now, the first of these was an Israelite composition. It portrays Balaam as a spiritual practitioner of pagan arts who is typically not looked upon very positively in Israelite culture. But the second one, the Balaam text of Deir, Alla, seems to see Balaam as a sort of spiritual hero, or at least as a spiritual practitioner portrayed in a positive light. So we have two books of Balaam, one written by his fans and one written by his detractors, which I think is really interesting. As for Balaam himself, most of the details around his life and personality have unfortunately been lost to time, but because we have a few historical sources about him, there are a couple of conclusions that we can draw. First, Balaam appears to have been a historical person. He doesn't show up exclusively in Israelite narrative, but he also shows up in non-Israelite texts as well, or at least one of these. On top of this, in both references, Balaam is understood to be a spiritual practitioner, somebody who is acknowledged by his culture as being able to tap into the divine realm, much like a prophet, a seer, or a vision seeker would. So it seems that there was a spiritual practitioner named Balaam in antiquity, and he's the source of both the stories in the Old Testament about Balaam and also the prophecies of Balaam preserved outside of the Bible. So there we have it. Balaam was a Levantine seer known in antiquity by the Israelites in their narratives, but also by others outside of the nation of Israel. He was apparently recognized as a practitioner of divine arts, including divination and approximating what the Israelites would call prophecy. I hope everybody enjoyed this video. It was good to be back into more biblical stories again. I know the Dagon episode was a little bit more adjacent to the Bible rather than digging deep into it, so it's good to be back in the text again where I belong. The next video next week is going to be a really good one. We're going to be talking about the esoteric legacy of one of Israel's most famous kings, so if anybody wants to hear about the legends of King Solomon, then you're welcome to stop by again next week. If anybody has some suggestions on things that they would like to see explored deeper, or if they just have any obscure passages in mind that are kind of weird that they'd like to see unpacked, feel free to leave comments below. I'm always happy to find more ammunition for doing more videos like this one. So if you've stuck with me all the way to the end, thank you so much for your time. Take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.